Hi, my name is Jen Tran. I am an artist and community organizer living here in Virginia in the DMV. I'm 28 years old and I work in urban planning and architecture, but otherwise I make visual art and print media, and I organize with a group called the Viet Place Collective. We're an anti-gentrification and cultural preservation grassroots organization. So before I get into my immigrant story, I wanted to kind of talk about the idea of immigrant stories as a whole. It's an idea I actually wanted to explore with my art and that I came upon through my work organizing. So just a brief summary of Viet Place. We are working to protect Vietnamese small businesses from commercial displacement that comes with development, and how gentrification changes neighborhoods and displaces small businesses. So during the first year of organizing, my co-organizers and I did a lot of press interviews. We were talking to the Washington Post, we were talking to ABC, just to raise awareness about these businesses and about the changes that were coming. And inevitably, a lot of these reporters would ask for our immigration story and our family's immigration story. A lot of us are second generation, as am I. We were born here, and our parents are children of Vietnam, and inevitably the war in Vietnam. So to be clear, a lot of our stories and our parents' stories are pretty traumatic. Immigration as a whole, being displaced from the only place you know to leave and maybe never come back, is a very traumatizing experience. Especially people who are displaced after war. And so in sharing these stories, some of the responses we would get from these reporters were, great, awesome, amazing, beautiful. And to me, it's a little bit of cognitive dissonance because I'm like, is it beautiful? It's pretty awful. It's pretty horrible to recount these stories of what our parents had to go through, what our entire generations of people had to go through, and have it kind of reduced to a byline and have that be awesome. I think I understand, and I think it is really beautiful, the resilience of Vietnamese people and refugees and immigrants as a whole, but the story is much more complicated than that. And I was realizing in these interviews that there is a certain way that refugee stories are commodified. They're distilled into taglines that advance a narrative that is not our own. So in this case, maybe a reporter's narrative is, look at these ideal Asian refugees who escape communism and come into the embrace of America and start their lives with nothing and build these amazing businesses and a life for themselves. Aren't they worthy of saving? Aren't they worthy of protecting? That's, to serve their anti-gentrification narrative. And I think these people mean well, but it definitely got me thinking a lot about, telling our own stories through our own lenses and how to resist the commodification of these very rich stories, not to serve other people's narratives, but to tell the stories in the ways they want to be told instead of telling them in ways we think they'll be best received by others. So that is one of the leading questions in one of my most recent projects, which was a zine called Smells Like Rice. So zines are homemade magazines. They're self-published. They come from DIY culture. A lot of times they resist commodification by their existence. There's no advertisements in them. They're not meant to make a profit necessarily. They're really just to spread art and information. In the 60s and 70s, they were used a lot to spread political ideology. So we continue that culture now with zines. And so that was one of the questions I was asking is, what would it look like to make a cookbook that kind of resists the Western gaze, resists the commodification of our food and our stories by not necessarily catering to a Western audience, but what does a zine look like that's cooking by Viet people for Viet people? I grew up watching Food Network a lot religiously, and especially in the 2000s, and even now a little bit, when we explain ethnic cuisine, there's a lot of othering language. It's always explained with the vocabulary of Western cuisine. So, it's always seen as something foreign and needs to be explained in a Western context. So like fish sauce is a fermented, sour, tangy anchovy vinegar. And like to a Viet person, you don't need to explain what fish sauce is. Fish sauce is the essence of Viet cooking. But in a lot of these cookbooks and shows and recipes, ethnic cuisine is, exoticized, and again, catered to a Western palate. So the tagline of Smells Like Rice is a cooking zine for family. It's not for the home cook, it's not for the Western eyes, it's for family. And so I wanted to tell these stories and archive my family history in a way that felt genuine, in the tradition of our parents' cooking. So let's see. One of the short passages I wanted to share is one of the intro pages, basically setting the scene for how this zine is written. So it says, "These recipes are written in the tradition of our mother's cooking, approximate measurements based in family tradition and oral history. I encourage you to cook intuitively, tasting as you go. It's how our ancestors cooked, by taste and good judgment. Ultimately, measurements should be to your palate, a pho spoon here and a coffee spoon there." So the idea being, when our moms teach us how to cook, they give really vague instructions. They're like, just a couple spoonfuls there. You taste it, you'll know. So there's really not a lot of measurements. The recipes are pretty brief. It's under the assumption that you paid attention while you're standing at the stove with your mom. And really, that's what this zine is about. For me, it's an archive of family history. I love looking through old photos, whether they're of my family's or just archival photos, film photos from the 60s and 70s. I think they're beautiful and fascinating. And it was my attempt to connect to my family history. For me, family recipes are kind of like time travel. They connect me to my grandmother and her mother. All of these people in these family photos that I have never met, and I probably will never meet. Faces I don't know but are familiar to me. Recipes and food kind of serve as a vessel for all of those memories. And I think that's true for all people, whatever culture you come from, that food is very much a vessel for memories and smells and recollections and stories that you have. And so I think for diasporic children, it's especially important to be keeping these recipes and keeping these memories alive, because in some ways, when you're displaced from your place of origin, your connection is the food, is the things that came from the ground in the land that your people are from, and what you make of them, and the tastes and the smells of all of those experiences. So that's a very long-winded way of saying there's a lot of family photos in this zine. So, first page is pictures of my mother and her mother, my dad, my sister's in there, and it says, "For my mom and her mom. She taught her how to cook, then she taught me how to eat." So, really, it's a love letter. It's by a Viet person for a Viet audience. The cover itself, this is actually an envelope that my father sent to my mother while she was in America and he was still in Vietnam. So in my house, we have like buckets and buckets of all of this paper ephemera, basically, from, I guess, the 80s to the 90s. like pounds and pounds of love letters from my dad to my mom and my mom to my dad. And again, all of these photos of people, my family, but also their friends, their neighbors. Just a moment in time that, my only connection is these photos and these letters. So I wanted to document them. And I think in a lot of ways, immigrant stories can become kind of like legends, especially when they're told by our parents. There's details missing, and there's kind of like vague, obscure storylines, and the storyline shifts as they're retold. And as I get older, I get more of these stories. And so part of this was also an attempt to sit down with my mom and say, all right, let's nail down this story. I need to understand for myself. And it's not necessarily in the zine. It was really, the zine is a vehicle for me to connect with my mom and then my grandmother, who is no longer here, to get an understanding of what these things all mean to them. So I guess back to the cooking. On the topic of not catering this to the cookbook Western audience, the first recipe in here is for Quynh H, which is caramelized fish. And I wouldn't say that Quynh H is like an easy starter recipe for someone just starting out with Viet food. But honestly, I don't care. It's meaningful to me. There's a little anecdote in there about how, my mom and I would sit at our kitchen table and eat seafood, picking fish bones out of our teeth and like getting into the nitty-gritty of picking at crab shells. And I think the smell of caramelized fish is very familiar to a lot of Viet kids, whether you like it or not. It's pungent, it's rich, it's sweet. So the smell and the taste is very reminiscent of the feeling of home and the feeling of family. And so again, this first recipe in my book, I was very deliberate about saying, it doesn't, if this doesn't resonate with you, it doesn't resonate with you. But for the people that it does, you will understand. It's not an over-explained, oversimplified idea of what our culture is and what our family history is. It is just as it is. There's no dumbing it down. And I think that made this project a lot more meaningful for me. So I'm currently working on a part 2. We'll have to see what it contains. But I think the through line of all of these stories is kind of resisting the erasure by the dominant narrative, by retelling these stories in our own way, in a genuine way, not just in the way that's easily swallowed by others, but in a way that resonates with the audience that matters. I think for Asian representation in America, we spent many, many decades just trying to get a spot in media. And so that meant making ourselves palatable, making ourselves relatable. And now we're kind of here. There is Asian representation, and that is just the beginning of the struggle. And really what it is now is resisting the erasure of the true, authentic culture, speaking for us, by us, to our own lens, seeing ourselves through an Asian lens and not through a Western lens. So that smells like rice. Yeah, I think on the topic of, I guess, legend and our own immigrant stories. So again, I'm a second generation immigrant. My parents were born in Vietnam. My dad comes from a very big family of, I think, 10-ish, maybe more. I could sit down and count all the aunties and uncles. They were born in Da Nang and grew up in Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City. And my mother comes from a much smaller family. She was adopted after her mother passed away pretty young, and her father was a GI, so he was never really in the picture. My mother's story has always kind of lived as a legend in our family. Obviously, it's a painful part of history, a personal history, that it's difficult for her to recount. And I think that is maybe the difference between my generation of Vietnamese people and my parents' generation. I am, and a lot of my friends are, very fascinated by the past. We're always looking at old photos, we're always looking for that story, and we understand the pain. I think we hold the pain in a very different way than our parents do. And when I was a lot younger and before I understood, I used to think, why am I so soft? Why am I crying about a war that I never experienced firsthand? It felt wrong, I guess, or it felt inappropriate to be feeling so many deep emotions from something that wasn't my lived experience. But as I get older and as I connect more with other Viet artists and other young folks exploring these ideas, I realized that we hold the pain that our parents could not. We are born with this inherited memory in which we have the space to start to unpack the pain and the sadness and also the joy and the generative beauty of all of our parents' experience. Our parents were tasked with surviving, and part of surviving trauma is compartmentalizing, putting these things aside in order to just live. And I think that's the mindset that a lot of our parents have, and so it's hard to want to revisit the past. The thinking is, that was something hard, but that was in the past. Why are you asking about it now? And so learning these stories as a younger person is about bridging that gap and understanding where they come from. They're not resistant to telling these stories because they don't want to tell us. It's because it's a very deeply rooted and very painful history. And so part of our job as young people who have both the burden and the blessing of these stories is to translate not by language but by feeling, and not only uplift the burden of these stories, but the joy and the beauty and all of what comes from it. We wouldn't exist without these stories, and so if we can handle them with care, I think that's a wonderful responsibility to have. I guess that connects to another project I did, is a small, unfinished portrait series of the women in my family. I started it with a portrait of my biological grandmother. So my mother's mother, a woman I never met and a woman my mom hardly knew. But her picture always sat on our mantle, on the banta, which is where we put incense and we put our fruits and our offerings and we pray. My mother's side has a picture of her biological mother and her adoptive mother. And there's no men on that side, so it's a matriarchal altar. And when I was younger, I always thought that this woman is so beautiful. We have one picture of her. I think it's, probably from the 50s or 60s. It's very old and it's very lovingly protected because it's the one image we have of this woman who is, to me, a mystery. And so I was just compelled to draw a portrait of her. And I was lucky enough to study under an Australian Aboriginal artist who was teaching how to do photorealistic portraits. And he would do portraits of his family in order to, again, resist erasure of Aboriginal Indigenous culture, kind of document these people in his family as giants, as hyper-real, beautiful in full reality, all the pores and wrinkles, all of the nuances of humans' lived skin. So he taught us how to draw portraits, and I thought that was perfect to apply in technique to my grandmother. So I guess what I didn't expect in drawing this portrait was learning more about myself. In studying this image so carefully and drawing all of the details, all of the wrinkles and the angle of her cheekbones and the slight change in her eyes, I started to see my mother and myself. I would draw, I think in portrait drawing it's very challenging because it's especially challenging to draw a portrait of someone you know. because you see their face in and out. You have an idea of what their face looks like, of what they look like. It's more in your head than an image. So it was almost, it was a different challenge, drawing someone I had never met in person but only had an image of. But in drawing her, I realized I have met her. I've met her every time I look in the mirror. I meet her every time I look at my mother. Because I'll draw an idea of what an eye looks like, and then something wouldn't quite look right, so I would erase, and I would redraw, and then I would tuck in the corner of the eye, and in tucking in that little outside corner of the eye, I realized, oh, those are my eyes. I'm drawing my own eyes in this woman that I don't know. And so that was a really powerful way to connect to my lineage, a missing piece of my genealogy. And with that portrait, there's a poem about what I think her experience must have been. And these are gaps in the story, in the legend, that I have to fill in. Things that I can only imagine and make in story. So I plan to continue that portrait series, draw my adoptive grandmother, draw my mother, which will be challenging in its own way, and explore the rest of my family and what that means. So in our organizing with Viet Place, we are really intentional about making it an intergenerational effort, because the people at Eden Center, the Vietnamese Cultural Center in Falls Church, are largely older folks. They own the businesses. They, immigrated between the 70s and 90s. Most of them are in their 60s, and they have a very specific idea about America, about the ideas of freedom and the values of capitalism and hard work, entrepreneurship and business ownership. And as young organizers, a lot of us have slightly different politics than the rest of the people in the older community. And it's important that we don't let that keep us from creating a coalition, because our common goal is to preserve Vietnamese heritage and our legacy. But it's definitely interesting, and it's been a bit challenging to mobilize older people to essentially criticize government, criticize the government's actions, the local government in their attempts to develop new retail and new residential and kind of change the fabric of the neighborhood. I think the older generation has been very hesitant to speak up and come to these government meetings and say anything to the contrary, or even believe that the government is willing to help. It's a very complex relationship, I think, because the older generation has this idea of what an over-involved communist government has done and can do, while at the same time putting the American government on a pedestal of affording them passage to the free land, America, the promised land. Whereas the younger generation can kind of take a step back and see the actions of the government without such a charged lens. We have the privilege of being born in a free society, and so we have the perspective that part of our freedom is the freedom to criticize the government and to look at their actions, both past and present, and really critically think, does this serve our community as a whole? Is this just serving, who is this serving? Is this serving a developer, someone who is meant to make money? Is this serving the hedge fund that these buildings will be sold to? That's getting into the nitty-gritty of development. But there are a lot of nuances with organizing with a group of people who don't necessarily share all of your political values. I think Part of actually a research project I did, delving into organizing with an older Viet community, was trying to understand the impact of war on their lived experience and how that may affect their political understandings now living in this country. And that's separate from, a national politics, conservative liberal ideology, but more in like, how do older Viet people show up in their local community? How do they want to be represented? How do they want their stories told? And in that, a lot of personal research with myself and my friends and their parents, and coming to the realization that older folks are very proud of being American, but they don't want their narratives centered around the painful past. A lot of people want to center their narratives on the success of what they've built here in America, and what that means for the future. And so it's not as much focused on a damage narrative of, younger people may be much more mobilized by learning about the injustices of the local government in the past displacement that Vietnamese community has experienced by, development in Arlington, and the displacement of people in the 80s, and the injustice of the current day policies, whereas older folks are not as moved by that. They don't want to continue to hear about the government's injustices, even though that is what we're talking about. They do want to hear about what's hopeful and what they can build and what they have agency over. I think because for so long, their stories are centered along a lack of agency, a loss of control. And so what resonates with them now is what do I have control over? What can we build? And not necessarily what are we fighting against? So it's definitely a different messaging that resonates with young people versus older people, and organizing a multi-generational coalition is definitely about speaking two different messages that serve the same purpose. And so I think that loops back to the art that I find inspiring. I am honestly inspired by a lot of young artists because they are questioning the narrative that we are fed, questioning the American excellence storyline that many Vietnamese kids grow up with. It's putting a more critical view on the forces that brought our parents from Vietnam to America. There's a little bit of a yearning for the homeland, which sounds really cliche, but it's more about wanting to understand the stories that we weren't told, because in school we're told the American perspective, and even at home we're told the American perspective, because that is our parents' lived experience of feeling saved, feeling redeemed by American forces, by America. But younger artists are really dissecting these narratives that imperialism and war are the only way forward, that they're the only way to carry out justice in the world. And speaking to a lot of my co-organizers, there's kind of this idea of two different definitions of freedom. There's freedom to do whatever you want, freedom to invade another country, freedom to have a gun. And then there's the idea of freedom from oppression, freedom from separation, freedom from capitalist forces that make you work 60 hours a week to feed yourself and have a roof over your head, freedom from these limiting, dehumanizing factors that still plague us in this freedom. So really it's unpacking, what is that? What does that freedom mean? It means something totally different to me than it means to maybe someone else who has grew up in a different decade or grew up in a different country even. So both in organizing and in artistry, I think a lot of young people are unpacking those things and trying to unfold those narratives and learning as we go. Learning stories from our elders, but also speaking our own stories, reading other histories from non-American history books and seeing what that teaches us.